Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic ReCon, testimonies from reverts and converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask. This week's guest is Jesús Canchola Sánchez. He had his first short story published at the age of 7 in his Chicago elementary school newspaper. He received the Hispanic Playwrights in Residence Award by Intar Theater and won the Pregones Theater Asuncion Playwrights Competition. His book, his first novel, Escape from Natura Meta, it came out in 2025, and there's a lot more that we can get into, but I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to talking about a number of things with you, Jesus. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Appreciate being on here. Thank you for having me.
So, how did your faith journey begin?
One of the strongest memories that I have as a child, must have been about 5 or so. I was born and raised Catholic. And I went to Mexico for the first time. I was born and raised in the Midwest, and my parents are from Mexico. And my mother took me it was December, so it was December 12th, which is Virgin of Guadalupe Day, celebration of our Holy Mother. And she had made a promise that she would do a pilgrimage when she returned to Mexico after many years of not being there. And I remember just being in awe with the throngs of people in Mexico City, which is where, the cathedrals are in her honor. And I had never been exposed as a child to that level of kind of a magnanimous kind of a representation of faith. And I was just remember being, as a child, right? Everything's so new and you're so curious about everything. And I just remember seeing my mother with the throngs of people and then getting on her knees and making the trail up through the aisle of the cathedral up until we saw the image of the Holy Mother there. And that has stayed with me, since that moment. And I just remember understanding a higher power as a child, understanding faith, understanding believing. And that for me kind of set a root, especially the women in my family, my mother, my grandmother, my aunts have been really core into kind of just my overall upbringing, but in particular, kind of my understanding of faith. And I think that's where it started. I think that's where I had that root, and then things went awry. you know?
Okay, what age did things go awry? Do you have vivid memories of when things started to feel, I don't know, like they were going in a bad direction?
Yes, I do. And it has to do with losing voice. What I feel was losing voice. Many things happened uh, in my childhood that caused me to fold in to myself and to begin to question everything, just the existence in general. And being at this time around, I must have been around 7 or 8. So not that long after that, memory of being in Mexico City at the cathedral for the Day of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Um, everything just shifted because, and I'm going to share this because it's very much core to where I'm at now, and my experiences, not just creatively, but also personally, just my whole life. And I think the shift in my own identities, I think, really began here with that questioning. I think where the evil one really kind of began to test me. Um, so as a young boy of about 7 or 8, everything kind of changed because I was raped as a young boy, and that really shifted everything. Right? It was the questioning, just destruction of innocence, and from that moment on, from that young age, for about 6 to 7 years, it was I was a piece of meat. I was someone else's kind of pleasure toy. And and I've dealt with that. It's a part with anyone that's gone through that kind of trauma. That's just something that's a part of you, that's with you. And I think writing was a way for me to kind of understand the world, to escape kind of those realities. And it wasn't until I was about 13, 14 where I had the courage and the strength and felt enough of a power within me to say no, and where that abuse ended. And even though the abuse ended, that experience stays with you. It's a part of you. And I mentioned that because it tested just my whole understanding of the world. Even though I understood I had a relationship with God, I think that began to, those experiences, that trauma, my closing in on myself, I felt the need to distance myself from everything, including God. And I think it was around that age, 13, 14, where I was supposed to do my confirmation. I had, I've been baptized as a child. I did my first communion. And, the next natural moment with the sacraments in the Catholic Church is, you do your confirmation. I lied to my mother. She would drop me off. I was 13, 14, so she would still like take me around. And I ended up hanging out with the little 5-year-olds, like drawing. I would like hang out in the little kids group because my friends were teaching them. And I would just draw with them and play and hang out, and I wouldn't go to like the confirmation class. And my mother didn't find out till towards the end of the confirmation class when she was told, well, he can't do it. He didn't go. And my mom was like, what do you mean? I dropped him off. And then she had this talk with me, the kind of parent talk where it's like, she wasn't like angry and yelling, but she was mad. She was more than mad, she was disappointed, and it was like, I think that's worse than her yelling at me. And that was really kind of the first manifestation of me rebelling against going to the church. And I stopped going to mass, and I really started to rebel spiritually, questioning. And then as I got into high school and beyond, I think I started to try to find meaning and understanding in all different kinds of things. I began to question just politically. I think I was 18 when I was invited by a communist party to go to Cuba, and interact with youth. It was a youth festival, and that ideologically just started to kind of shift, kind of my understanding of the world and influence it as well. And that particular ideology, there's a part of it, a layer of it that, you have to distance yourself from faith, like any kind of spirituality, because the party, right, the government is what's uplifted, right? The state is the solution, right? And that kind of opened the door to all these different kinds of identities for myself. And I think the sexual trauma informed kind of as I developed myself into adulthood, into really what now I understand to be harmful sexual practices and debauchery that really caused harm to myself and to others. And at that time, because I was beginning to be involved in these different identity bubbles, it was actually celebrated, right? I was like a young adult going into like a small liberal arts private school in the Midwest where anything goes, drugs, sex, radical political ideologies. All of these things kept taking me away from my faith. All of these things kept taking me away from kind of the core beliefs that I had been raised with, you know? And I went with it, right? As a young adult, you kind of just go along with your peers. And I chose to do that. And that informed kind of my identities. I mean, I did begin to identify as a gay man in my early, like late teens, early 20s. And that kind of just bloomed into this like core identity that felt the world, that was my world, that was the thing that I wanted to pursue. And what I mean by be, it's like it encompassed kind of everything around me. It was the core thing. It was like the idol, right? It was the idol that I was identifying with as I grew to become more and more distanced from the church. Eventually I finished school and I went to grad school in New York City. So I kept putting myself in places that allowed for further questioning, further experimentation, further exploration in all the different identities that I had taken on as my own. And fortunately, throughout all of this time, my relationship with my grandmother since the moment I was born has been a really special one. She's a light in my life from the moment she carried me in her arms. This is my father's mother. She actually just passed away about a year ago, so it just in May, it was her 1 year anniversary. She lived to be 96 years old, and she was such a blessing to have in my life. I am so grateful, and I'm so grateful to God that she was my grandmother. She was the only one during this whole time that I would go to mass with. And it wasn't a conversation where she would like force me or like be like, you have to. It was more just out of respect. I would go. And she, through her example and her own strength of faith, just compelled me to follow her, and I would go. And it ended up being that one of the places where I would find solace, and even though on my own I wouldn't go to mass, I did look for the solace of being in the church, like just being in the space. I wouldn't go to mass, but I would, go find a church and an open church, and I would just go in and sit and contemplate and pray, and I didn't really know that I was praying, but I was praying, you know, and it gave me comfort. Even during this tempestuous time in my life, it gave me such comfort just to be within the holy place of God, to be in that sacred place. And in New York City, I ended up, finishing school, and identifying as a gay man ended up being kind of a professional thing as well. Like I ended up being a communicator. I worked for one of the largest LGBT organizations in the country, and I was doing a lot of media work. It's actually how I ended up, quote unquote, coming out to my family was through media. I was on a radio show in the Midwest, and my family heard it because I hadn't actually had the conversation with them. It was they heard it, and then I had the conversation with them, and um, and that became such an integral part of my life, and just creatively also. Early on you mentioned my plays. That's how I began writing professionally, and the core themes of my work early on had to do with my identities, like queerness or being of Mexican, descent, or whatever identities or political ideologies, leaning way more to the left, um, whatever it was that I felt I needed to have a message on. That's what most of the focus, but it tended to be the queerness or the LGBT part of what that identity I thought I had was. And sexually, I thought I was like, I'm free, I can explore, but it ended up being such a difficult, painful, and not where I wanted to ultimately be, you know? And as much exploration and experimentation as I did, I ultimately realized that, I couldn't have relationships because I hadn't, early on after, school had been finished and I started working as a young adult, I hadn't really dealt with my trauma in a healthy way. I was really just coping. You just kind of sometimes you just kind of keep living and you hold it in and you hold it in. And sometimes it just gets to an explosive place and then you act out. And I think sexually that's what I did. I acted out sexually, and ended up taking me to really dark places, doing really unhealthy things that caused harm to me and to others. Now I realize that. And I got to like the darkest, the lowest point in that I could possibly get to, which is like the thought of ending life. And through my writing, through my creative work, that was one of the places, even though I was exploring these themes that were part of what I thought were my identities, it helped me understand and process. Just the act of writing was really helpful for me to be able to kind of have a dialogue with myself. And I began to seek treatment, which was really helpful. Like counseling, therapy in particular was really helpful. Some therapists weren't great. Some therapists were awful.
Hey, Jesus, what year did that start happening, the therapy?
Ooh, I would say I in my mid 20s. So I was like at young professional working,
Yeah.
finally working. I had health insurance, so I was able to access the resources. Um, but also I was mature enough also to understand that there were resources, that I could access.
Sure.
And all of that helped, but there was still this void, and I think, at this time I was still living in New York, living kind of the young adult, single, young professional, like trying to make his way in the world. That's when my first plays started getting produced. So creatively, I was also kind of getting some kind of traction in my work and attention, positive attention, which always helps, to help you propel, to continue creating, continue working. But there was this darkness and this void that I had, that ultimately, I decided to return to the Midwest, which is where most of my family is. And in that return, which was about 7 or 8 years ago, when I came back home, um, I felt the need to connect with my family. And what that also meant was that I started to also connect to my roots of faith and how was raised. And when I returned home, I also started to proactively, seek my relationship with God. And that to me also meant returning to the church and going to Mass. At this time, my relationship with my grandmother continued full force. And as I began to proactively search a relationship with God, my grandmother began to also teach me more prayers. I started to learn the Rosary with her. Every time I was with her, at this time, the last years of her life, my grandmother lived full time in Mexico, and I would visit her at least 2, 3 times a year. And I just began to ask more questions about her faith, and I began to ask questions about why does she do this, or why does she do when we're at church, why do we do that? She began to be a guide for me in a very uh, direct way in terms of why we do what we do as Catholics. And then I began to read the Bible, and I began to go to Mass, and I decided, when I was 13, 14, I rebelled and I didn't do my confirmation. At this time, I returned and I went to finish what I hadn't finished, back then. And about 5 years ago, I did my confirmation, thank God. And I began to really learn about the different teachings of the church, the reasoning behind them. And I think at that time also was when I had an awakening about this relationship that I had with my identities that I thought were so important in my life and core to my life. And really began to question why I was doing what I was doing, and I think for me, it's so connected to the sexual trauma from a child. In many ways, I'd been reliving what had happened to me as a child because I'd been, for years, I'd been programmed to do certain things, to behave in certain ways. And returning to the safety of the church and understanding the teachings of the church, it completely opened my eyes. And I began to find a different kind of relationship with myself and a joy that I hadn't had, that I hadn't experienced because I've been so wrapped up in my own bubble of coping, in my own bubble of what I thought was truth that I couldn't see. I was blinded by all these things that were actually just kind of taking me away and further away from God. And I began to really go deep into kind of what I was doing, and then and what I mean sexually, the debauchery, that I've been living, and then really beginning to understand the teachings of the holiness of our bodies, the that we're all called to chastity, no matter what kind of attractions you have, as an adult. And I began to kind of just put pieces together. And as I did that, and I began to find resources also within the church, thank God the church has a number of apostolates that help all kinds of folks, including folks that have same sex attraction or have childhood traumas of different kinds, including sexual traumas. And I found a community that really helped guide that the return to the teachings and respecting my body and respecting the body of others and really living towards chastity in a healthy way. And that honestly has been such a joyous experience to be able to work on it. I'm still working on it. There's no easy click, with anyone who's lived through trauma, um, will know it's a lifelong process. And for me, creatively, throughout all this time, I was still creating, right? I started doing plays, then got into production work, and then I ended up doing a movie, my first movie that I shot in Mexico City about it actually came out about maybe 9 years ago that it came out. That I shot it, finished it. I did the whole festival circuit. I did at that, and at that time I was still identifying as a gay man. So the whole festival circuit was like the whole LGBT film festival circuit for the most part, because it was a gay themed story, and it had a level of attention that I began to kind of have more attention on my creative work. But the more attention I was receiving, the less kind of appetite I had for it, to continue creating, which was really interesting because, what you would think someone who's creative and wants to share his work wants to get that attention. But then I realized that was just not my authentic voice. It's not what I was feeling. It was not real. It's not the message that I wanted to send out to the world with those kinds of stories anymore. So I think returning to the church helped me find my authentic voice just as me, myself, as Jesus. And creatively, in particular, it kind of created a shift in the things that I wanted to explore. And my most recent project, which you also mentioned, Escape from Natura Meta, which is my debut novel, it's a dystopian story, so it's completely fiction, but there are elements of it that I think are parallel to my experience in terms of finding faith again, finding faith. Uh, my relationship with my grandmother is reflected. The main character, the person who guides him through dreams, is his ancestor, whose name is Beatriz. My grandmother's name was Beatriz. And there are a few things in there that are autobiographical, but definitely it's a fiction story. But ultimately it's about finding truth and finding your way and becoming, going from being a young boy to a man. And what does that mean? In a place, it takes place in a dystopian future where he's part of a tribe where science is kind of the ultimate force of truth for that particular tribe, and they've hidden all things faith, all things related to God. They see that as illogical. And I felt like those were my bubbles, those bubbles as I was going through my own experience, it felt that way. It felt like even talking about God in certain spaces or even talking about that I was raised Catholic, it sometimes felt like a dangerous conversation. And the story reflects kind of where I'm at now. And I'm really grateful to be able to share it and have the opportunity to talk about where I'm at.
So great. So the book, there's so many questions I have. Okay. So the book you just published this year, and you talk about there are certain elements that parallel your own experiences. Has it been well received yet? How has that been getting this launched in a climate it's a little hostile towards finding true identity, facing yourself in a real sense, getting help from trauma and all the different life experiences. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's been a process. So the book just came out. It's been out in the market about a month, so it's still pretty new. It has been really interesting to share my story more publicly in terms of my return to faith and also letting go of identities that were so core. And I think so many of my communities, we connected because of those identities. And it's been a transition. I think I've had to distance myself, or people have chosen to distance themselves from me, because the more I talk about it, the more, whether it's now I'm doing it more publicly because of the book, and I've chosen to share my own personal story. But I have had like conversations through my process with my dear core friends, and of course my family. My family, they've always been really supportive and there and loving and praying with me, praying for me. That love I have always felt, and thank God for that. It's been such a core part of my support system throughout my life, and it's still there, and I still feel it. And it's a very joyous moment in my relationship with my family because I have returned fully to the church. I think all of them were praying
Yeah.
for me, to return. And my grandmother in her last years, in particular, I think us praying the Rosary together were some of the most beautiful moments in my life. Just having her, and I'm so grateful for that. And I think the people that have chosen, or that I've chosen to not be surrounded by, I think sometimes that's needed, to no longer be in certain spaces that will trigger certain behaviors or will question you in certain ways that aren't healthy. I'm all for constructive conversations, and that has happened also. Um, but sometimes distance is what's needed, and I've also founded new communities. And I talked about the apostolate that I'm a part of, that's part of the Catholic Church, which is called Courage, which helps men and women who are same-sex attracted with resources and support. And I actually was just at an event not long ago, over Memorial Day weekend, that they have, which is a great event. They call it sports camp, and it's like how to have healthy friendships, and using sports as a way to do that. There's a lot of prayer and mass, and,
Yeah.
and we have the support of priests and our brothers and sisters that attend. So even though some communities shift and change, or there's a distance, I have also found more strength in my relationships with my own family, and also new friends and new community that has helped me further understand where I'm at, and are supporting me in particular with my relationship to the church, ultimately to the Lord. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm really grateful. And, it's been at times really challenging because it could be painful when you're dealing with interpersonal relationships and dealing with strong emotions. I mean, I think anytime you talk, in particular, I have found that it can be such a harsh trigger when you identify as a gay man for a big chunk of your adult life, and then you begin to question that, and you begin to share that, and you begin to say, that's no longer my identity. Like, I don't think it ever really was my identity. It had, for me, really deep connections to childhood trauma and things that I had gone through. And now I understand that, and I'm returning to my faith, which also has very specific teachings about the practices of sexual practices and respect for our bodies and respect for marriage, and respect for the complementary relationship between a man and a woman,
Well said.
and it can be really challenging because when you're speaking to a community that you were so tight with, and then all of a sudden that identity that was so core to your relationship is questioned or is no longer part of my equation, it can trigger some really difficult conversations, and emotions. They can run really high. Just as like talking about faith in general in some circles. I've been in as a communicator, I worked a lot in different organizations. Early on, I talked about LGBT organizations, but I also talked about like human rights organizations. I worked at human rights organizations on immigration issues, environmental issues, all different kinds of things where faith is not necessarily welcome as a layer within what they define as social justice, which is really interesting, right? Because the whole concept of social justice really it comes from Christianity.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's been an interesting journey, and I'm on it. I'm on it right now, and I think this conversation will trigger more, more dialogue with
Oh
people that
yeah.
are in life. I welcome it. I have nothing to hide, and I'm being truthful with where I'm at, and I'm also happy to share my relationship with God. I think for such a long time, I saw Catholicism as something to be ashamed of, and I would call myself like a Catholic, what term did I use? It was like I'm a cultural Catholic, like I grew up, I understand the symbols, I know what they are, but, I don't believe any of it. And that was okay to say, and my friends were like, yeah, 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 me too,
Yeah.
and, but once you understand the actual connection of, especially when you were born in there, in the faith, you really begin to understand kind of the root of like everything that's been a part of your life from the moment of birth, and all the sacraments that we're a part of, and all the
Yes.
biblical connections to all
Yes.
the rituals of mass, and the rituals of the church and your connection to them, and then the hierarchy of the church. And I think it's just such a beautiful connection and such a deep tradition and rooted to the beginning of the faith, and that to me has, the more I learn about it, the more I read the Bible, the more I work on my prayer practice, and the more I work on my relationship to God, the more I am grateful to be able to share that openly and be welcoming about it, and also be truthful. That's all I can do is be truthful. And I think my novel right now, Escape from
Yeah.
Naturalidad, is me being truthful creatively as a writer and sharing where I'm at.
That's what I was going to ask you. Two questions. So ultimately, what was the moment of motivation to write the book? Okay, so that's one part of it. And then there's another part. The Catechism speaks about that chastity is an apprenticeship in self mastery. I was wondering if you can speak to that element of the journey as well.
Oof, yeah. Uh, I'll start with the book part. It was really interesting for me going through, just like with many across the globe, going through the COVID epidemic in terms of our relationship to the state. And it was really eye-opening for me to see church leaders both being very um, with the state in terms of closing churches and just kind of going with the flow, while at the same time they're also being church leaders that opposed and were like, continue, we must continue, you cannot, and this was at a time where like churches were being closed, yet we had strip joints and all, like we had all this. It was just like such a wide, I was like, whoa, like that really for me began politically to shift my world. And I was already going through this spiritual transformation in my relationship with God, And I think for me, that began to spark something in me about what kind of story do you want to tell? I knew I wanted to write a novel because in my brain, writing a novel, that's like the ultimate test for any writer. No matter what kind of format you begin with, whether it's playwriting, short stories, screenwriting, which I also ended up doing, And I was like, no, no, but writing a novel like that, whoa, if I can achieve that, that was like my personal kind of like writer challenge that I wanted to get to. And I felt like I was at a point where I had enough tools, like through my craft, to be able to write a novel. And I was like, where am I going to go? Like, I didn't really have an idea yet. But then as I sparked like those questions of the relationship to the state, and then now as I was exploring the relationship with church, and God, and I was like, and I've always been a fan of dystopian stories. Of course, 1984, I read that in school. But like, they're so incredible, and because you can, as a writer in particular, you can go to so many places. And it began. I was like, I started outlining and drafting, and then the main character Gabriel came to mind, and this tribe came to mind, and I think it was really informed by how easily a population can be manipulated, how easily we can be manipulated by different kinds of information or misinformation, and that we can be so easily taken into this journey that takes us to very, very dark places. And you see it every day. You've seen it throughout history. You see it today, and not just through the COVID, you know, epidemic in terms of what some governments were doing, but also, look, no matter where you fall on the spectrum, there's a possibility for authoritarian,
Yes.
leadership, you know, um, and that's what sparked it. And then as I began to write, it just began to flow. And, Gabriel came to life, his ancestor came to life, the tribe came to life. And then eventually the characters just started speaking to me, but it all was within this vein of this young boy becoming a man in a world that he started to question, where his ancestor guided him and took him on this journey. And he goes on this journey and he has this mission. And then he begins to meet Christians who have been questioning for a really long time. And his mind is blown. And he's like, this is what my ancestor has been saying to me in my dreams. And she's like, you have to keep going. There's this book that's called the Bible, and you have to read it. And they've hidden it, but you can find it. I will show you the way. And then like he's on this journey to find the Bible, and he has to go south. So in my brain, after all these great wars, what's left is like a strip of the Midwest, giving a shout out to my Midwest roots. And like he goes south, and he goes to Louisiana. There's still a part of Texas, and he goes all the way south to Mexico. There's still a layer of Mexico. That's kind of like the landscape, right, that he's traveling. And does he find the Bible? I hope so. No,
Yeah, yeah.
you can read it.
We'll have to find out. We'll have to find out. Yeah.
But it just ended up being that was the spark, and then it just kind of took a life of its own, and the characters started to form themselves and started talking to me, and then I just started enjoying. I just started enjoying the process. Honestly, I think where I find the most joy creatively is when I'm just writing, and I find such like wonderful escape in a healthy way of I'm like fully me, I'm fully me, and I'm like sharing all of me in these characters, in these stories, in this journey that this character is taking. So that's what sparked it, and that's how it came to be, and I'm really grateful that I'm sharing it now. um there was what was the second part of there
I was
was
talking
a
about the catechism, the chastity is
mastery.
an
Yeah.
apprenticeship in self-mastery. Yeah.
Ooh,
And I'll
Eddie.
add one more thing to that question.
Yeah.
It has to be renewed in many different seasons of life, or so, I don't know verbatim what it says, but it's talking about it's ongoing. You did talk about that earlier. It's ongoing. You don't
Yeah.
just flip a switch, and this applies to all humans. It's ongoing, new seasons. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and honestly, so yes, I've been reading the Catechism, and of course, spiritual guidance from my local priests has been essential, and conversations. It's so helpful. And St. John Paul's theology of the body writings have also been incredible helpful to understand the root of the respect that we should have for our bodies and for the use of them and the purpose for them. and the relationship that our bodies have to God and how we worship with our full bodies, right? It's not just a part of us, it's all of us. And, it's been, and I mentioned, it's something I'm still working on, and from going from someone who believed, this was me, young adult, um, believed that there was strength in experimentation and doing whatever you wanted with your body, that no limits, anything goes, to having some really specific parameters. It's been because you grow to be accustomed to certain behaviors, and it's been one of the most challenging things I've had to do in my life is to be able to understand the reasoning behind chastity, but not just understand, but put it into practice. To actually believe by practicing the teachings of no masturbation, no pornography, respect for your body, no sexual activity unless you're in a marriage, between a man and a woman. And it's something I'm working towards because I think for me, the connection to the trauma, which is why I'm sharing that part also, because for me, it's also rooted in that. And I'm tested daily. I'm tested in a way that makes me stronger, thank God. And I'm finding ways of being able to be healthy about it. And even if I fall, that I have the church to help me through. Thank God for confession, that I can go and have conversations with my fellow courage brothers and sisters, that I can have conversations with church leaders, with my local priests that are available and make themselves available to have honest conversations. And of course, confession, to be able to understand that there's a commitment to be able to fess up to the things that you do. Amen. And that there's penance, and that you are able to continue on the path. Even when you fall, you get up and you continue. And I think that's honestly, it's ongoing. And I think right now I'm at a place of really thinking about vocation. I have started dating women, and it's been really interesting kind of process to to go through that now. As a full-on adult, and I've gone through all this series of life experiences that have brought me here. I don't know if marriage will end up being where I end up. I may end up being just a celibate single, and that's perfectly, being a single man. I don't know if the religious life is that. I'm like in that, but I think being true and honest with where I'm at, being true and honest with wherever you're at, in particular, if it's, I think there's an epidemic right now around sexuality and pornography in particular, with men in particular, kind of the addiction to pornography, disrespecting your own body, disrespecting others' bodies. The culture is challenging all of us, to kind of fall in line with this, what is termed liberalism, or freedom of choice. And I think the more you fall into that trap, the more damage. I certainly did a lot of damage to me, especially with my childhood history. And I am finding that the more I work on it, the more I understand harmony, and the more I connect to my own body in a healthy way, and the more that prayer has really helped me to gear me in the right direction. It's an ongoing process. I think it may be a lifelong process for me. It's certainly, through my experiences, I've had to go through all these challenges to be able to get to a healthy place with, my experiences where I'm at now. And the Lord helps you. The Lord really does guide you, and He's been guiding me, and I'm really grateful for that. And I think we have to stay on the path. Even as you fall down, you just have to get up. You have to get up and keep going and keep praying. And the rosary for me has been in particular a really powerful source of strength. Um, and I pray the rosary every day, and that helps me.
It's great. Yeah, what you just shared, I have to acknowledge that the courage is remarkable, and I appreciate that very much. And I know a lot of people will appreciate that as well. So I would, for all I know, the enemy tries to whisper about how can you share that. There's a reason to share all of that, right? And to help people that are caught up in all kinds of stuff. I just read this quote from Aleister Crowley, if you know, the British occultist from like the 19th, 20th century. Anyway, he said, "Do what thou wilt." And so many people have latched onto that mantra. And when in fact it's, God, what is your will? So I wonder if you can address that aspect of trying to understand in this journey what is his will. I know you're talking about discerning religious life versus getting married, but can you speak to that a little bit about trying to understand what it means to surrender yourself to God, not surrender yourself to yourself?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you're kind of like blowing my brain right now. I honestly, I think that's what I've been experiencing and what I've tried to um, layer into the journey that I put the character through in the novel, in terms of he begins in a place which is where I was at, of self, all self. And I think for me, my particular experience, I think I went there because there was a way to cope, to be able to understand and kind of protect myself from the dangers, that were out there. And they were really real. When someone attacks you physically and forces you to do something that you don't understand, especially as a child, when an adult, you know, forces himself on you, that destroys you. That completely. So you have to escape. For me, I had to escape. I had to go to these worlds outside of me to be able to cope. And I think through that, the more I explored that escapism, it led me to kind of just being so self involved, where it was always about protecting myself. And I think it evolved to these different identities, but I think that was kind of the root for me. And the more I began to question that self-importance, where anything goes, what I say is good, no matter what, no matter what. And I think the love that I felt for my family, and the love that I had for them and they had for me, that kind of reciprocal love that never ceased, really helped me balance that and help me grow and mature. Because I think it is an immaturity, right? When it's just like about the self all the time. And it's been such an incredible journey to be able to understand that one's own desire, one's own will means nothing unless it's connected to your relationship to God, unless it's about His will, you know? And I think I've been discovering that more and more as I understand my own relationship to God, as I understand the traditions of the church, the community of the church, the need for it. And when I was focusing only on myself, which at that time I saw as like, I need to protect myself from all the wrong, bad things. And I ended up doing so many more harmful things to myself and to others. I didn't have actual love. I didn't really understand that fully or live it or, fully have it until I began to love God fully. And then I understood what self-love was, what it was to have a beautiful relationship with my grandmother, with my mother, with my aunts, with my siblings, with my whole family, my friends, people around me that have been the core kind of support system for me. When you're so self-involved, and you are in a place where you are God, there's nothing to question that, right? Like, if you are God, if you are the ultimate logic, if you are the ultimate being, you yourself, whoa, right? Like, what freaking power you have. But if you actually live in the world, you begin to understand that seeing the reflection of yourself with your neighbor, loving your neighbor, being part of a community, your family, your church community, your in your workplace, that that interconnection is a reflection of the love that God has for us, that Jesus has for us, right? That God the Father sent his Son as a human being to experience life as a human being for us, to show us the way. Wow, like what an incredible, merciful Lord. you know, and I think the more you understand that connection, the more that self, the more that ego, the more that understanding of I know more, I know better. Because honestly, you see it within the Catholic Church too, in terms of people who question certain things that, there are ministries out there that question even things like, sexuality and same-sex relationships. And there are people within the church who are actively trying to change the teachings of the church. There are church leaders who are very prominent, who say very confusing things and, you know, challenging the authority of the church, And if it's within the church, imagine outside of the church. So I think that all does come
Yes.
from this self-reliance of you know better. I can read the Bible and I understand better, right? Our Protestant friends, who sola scriptura, there's this kind of self-aggrandizement, of like, I know better. And when you begin to realize that God is the one that knows, that truth, there's only one truth, and God has shared it with us, and that there's the church that guides us, that self ends up being one with your Lord, and you begin to embrace that. I certainly am embracing that. And it's challenging. I think we live in a really secular society in the US in particular, but I think this is a global phenomenon, especially in the West, where the faith is supposed to be hushed and it's supposed to be private, and if you even talk about it, be respectful, you can't say Merry Christmas, like all these things, that may end up may first be silly, and kind of like, oh, I'll follow the rules, but then end up being more and more. And then it's like at school, they teach certain things to children, no matter what their faith background is. And there's certain practices and certain kind of like um, beliefs that then start getting mixed with different things, and then like all of a sudden there's no God, you know, and the state is what should carry you through your life and do what you want, right? Just
Yeah.
like the quote you just shared with us. It's complicated, and I don't think it's specific to this particular time. I think you see it in the Bible
Yeah.
from the Old Testament to the New. Um, it just so happens that we are in this particular time.
Is there anything that we did not cover that you wanted to, Jesus? I want to make
Oh,
sure
I
that,
felt
yeah,
like
go
I
ahead.
went on such a journey in this
This is good.
conversation. I'm just really grateful to be here. And I'm so grateful that I can share my novel, Escape from Natura Meta. I think the more I have conversations, not just about my journey, but being able to write this story that has a parallel kind of journey for the character in a different world, in a different kind of setting, it's a joy to share it. And I hope folks check it out and let me know what you think.
Okay, so mention your website, where they can find the book. And I forgot there was a third thing, but go.
So you can find me my site, Jesús Canchola Sánchez, my full name.com. I'm on Twitter. I'm trying it out, Eddie, because I was not on social media for many years. And I think just about a year ago, I was like, let me test something. So
Sure.
I'm testing it. I am on Twitter. That's the only current social media account I have. So find me there.
Yeah.
Check out my website. And you can find Escape from Natura Meta at any place that sells books, Amazon, Walmart, Barnes and Noble, all the places. Check it out, and I would love your feedback. Write a review, be constructive. Let me know what you think, and check it out.
No, what a pleasure it's been. Thank you so much for not holding back, for being completely transparent about your journey. I know a lot of folks, I said it before, I'm going to say it again. There are a lot of folks that tune into channels not to comment. You would never know that they came to watch a specific video. I feel there will be a number of people that will find this video that need to hear the message and that they can be thankful that you responded to God's grace and praise God that he's just amazing and what he did to help you through that difficulty. And I would also add, anytime we hear a story like this, any story with trauma, I want to make sure that the audience remembers to pray not only for the victims, but also those that are perpetrators. As difficult as it is, that is a
Eddie,
charge from Jesus to
forgiveness.
to
You
forgive.
have to get to a place of forgiveness, and
And
that's
I know
rough.
I know you're like
Rough.
yeah, exactly. And someone might say it's easy for you to say. It's not easy for me to say. I'm just telling you that that is a charge
Yeah.
that we should take seriously. And I think it really helps everyone heal the more we do things like that. So um, I appreciate you very much, Jesus. Thank you so much. Everyone, please share this episode. And until next time, take care and God bless you all. Bye.